Hello, everybody. I hope you are enjoying your day off from the snowmageddon that we had that came through the area. Like I said on my announcement, I'm just going to record the first kind of batch of slides on this, and if you could just watch this before you come to class on Tuesday. So these are going to be from the PowerPoint that are in the modules right now on Canvas for the Gait section, which is the next section that we are going to be covering. So if you have your note packet, you're going to want to pull that out and go to that Gait section, which is going to be the next section after the peripheral mobilization, joint mobilization section. And you're going to want to fill in that information as I go through it here. I will try to review this briefly when we come into class on Tuesday, but I did want to give us just a kind of a head start with this because this is fairly complex information on the Gait cycle. So I wanted just to kind of make sure we had plenty of time to go through it and answer questions. So this is coming from Lippert, chapter 22. All right, so in order to understand gait, we have to understand first what normal gait is supposed to look like before we can start figuring out what's abnormal and what's wrong with their walking. So when we're talking about gait, we're talking about locomotion. We're talking about movement walking. So we need to be able to recognize in the rehab world and treat these abnormalities in gait. It's very critical that you understand the mechanics behind this, and that's what we're going to go over here in this section. So gait has its own set of terminology, and we divide gait into different phases to help everybody understand what you're talking about when you refer to it. So it's kind of a common terminology. I would recommend making some flashcards for the terminology when we get to that slide because you are going to be expected to know the different cycles and different phases within the gait cycle. So the term locomotion is simply a linear or translatory motion produced by a series of rotary movements of the joints of the body. So we will frequently refer to this as gait. We also may call it ambulation, which is another term that means walking. Normal human locomotion has been described as a series of rhythmical, alternating movements of the limbs and trunk that results in forward progression of the center of gravity. So if that's kind of the worst breakdown scientifically of how we walk, but it's describing, to someone who's observing, that's actually how we go through the walking cycle. Obviously, we don't have to think a lot about this because it seems to just happen, right? But we go through these movements almost in every joint that allows us to move forward. And that COG is center of gravity, so that's kind of moving our center of gravity forward to allow us to make forward motion. Many methods can be used to observe gait. Electromyography is one that we use to look at which muscles turn on when during the gait cycle. We have biofeedback devices that will light up to tell us when the muscles are being active. And simply now using video, we can slow down video analysis. We can look at when the foot is moving, what's happening. We can rewind it. We can zoom in. We have a lot of new tools with technology that we can use to analyze gait. All right, so we need to go into some of the basic definitions here. So these are things, again, you are expected to know. I would recommend doing some flashcards for these to kind of start getting the phrasing down. First thing is called the gait cycle. All right, a full gait cycle is all the activities that occur from the point of initial contact of your heel on one lower extremity. So let's say it's your left. That left heel hits the ground. A gait cycle is going to go from when that left heel hits the ground to the point at which that same heel hits the ground again. Okay, so left heel, which means now we take a right step forward, the left foot comes forward again, and then when that left heel hits the ground for the second time, that's the completion of a full gait cycle. Okay, so stance and swing are the two phases that occur within this gait cycle. So we have a stance phase, which basically means anytime the leg is in contact with the ground. So that starts at heel strike, The ground contact continues the lower extremity until it's no longer in contact with the ground at toe off. Swing phase is then going to be from the time that's not in contact with the ground until it goes all the way through and contacts the ground again. So this is where the instant of toe off until that heel hits the ground again, or we have what's called ground contact. All right, some additional basic definitions. We do have a period in every gait cycle of called double limb support, and that's going to be where basically both limbs are touching the ground at the same time. So one limb is beginning the stance phase and the other is ending the stance phase. So you can kind of see on the diagram below here that are drawn in this two rectangles, one leg is at toe off and the other leg is at heel contact. So we have these two circumstances where you have this happen twice within one gait cycle. This overlap of double limb support is about 20 to 22% of the gait cycle. Looking at the other ones percentage-wise, that stance phase overall is going to account for 60% of the cycle, whereas the swing phase is about 40% of the cycle. So it's important to know that we spend more time with the feet touching the ground than we do swinging through the air. As mentioned, double limb support is the overlap of the stance and swing phases where both feet touch the ground at the same time. So some of the terminology here that you're going to need to know, and this is that slide I was referring to where you're probably going to want to make flashcards for these. Kind of like manual muscle testing, there are two scales that are used for defining these different phases. The traditional and the Ranchos Los Amigos. That should say Los, not lost, sorry. Ranchos Los Amigos, or RLA. So these are the same things, but they have different names for their different phases, okay? You should know both terminologies. So in the stance phase, we have heel strike. On the Ranchos side, we have initial contact. Traditional, foot flat. Ranchos, loading response. Traditional, mid stance. Ranchos, also mid stance. Traditional is called heel off, whereas Ranchos, we call that terminal stance, or the end of the stance phase. In traditional, we call it toe off, whereas in Ranchos, we call that pre-swing. During the swing phase, the traditional terminology calls it acceleration, whereas Ranchos is going to refer to it as initial swing. Traditional refers to the next phase as mid-swing, and that's the same in Ranchos. And then finally, traditional defines the last phase as deceleration or slowing down, whereas Ranchos calls this terminal swing. So within stance, all right, we just mentioned those different terminologies for the different phases that occur during the stance cycle. Okay, all this is part of that overall gait cycle. So we've got those two phases, stance phase and swing phase. So first we've got stance phase. This is the single limb stability to maintain upright posture, and this helps to advance your body over top of that limb that's in contact with the ground. Okay, it also helps to prepare you to swing the other leg through, which continues the cycle. So we're going to start with the first one, which is heel strike, or the Ranchos definition is initial contact. I know these are really fancy diagrams that I've included here, but you get the point, okay? The single line that does not have dashes, so the solid line is going to be the stance limb in this case, and then the dashed line that you see there is going to be the one that's in movement. Okay, so heel strike, we're looking at this solid line, and that's where the instant that the heel contacts the ground, okay, it is considered a critical event that we have heel contact. This is that moment where it first touches the floor, and it should occur with the heel in normal gait. Moving forward now from heel contact, we go into what's called foot flat. So the knee, as you see, begins to bend on that stance leg side, and the foot goes from that heel contact position where the toes are in the air to where the toes are now down and the whole foot is flat on the ground. In the ranchos, this is called the loading response. And it involves that same concept, but they do include what happens at the other joints. Your knee begins to flex, as you can see on that solid graph, and your ankle will begin to plantar flex, which is what brings the ankle from that upward position down to the floor. The reaction of the limb is to absorb the impact of your weight. So they call this often weight acceptance. So this is the initial time where your body weight goes onto one leg and your leg has to make changes in order to accommodate your body weight. Now we're going to move to mid stance. So we're looking at that solid line again. Mid stance, the body now is coming forward and that body weight is now directly over top of that supporting leg. It's also called mid stance with the Rancho scale. They do concept referrals to the opposite leg and where it is in time, because in the Rancho scale, the leg is moving from behind the body to in front of the body. This is a critical event where you're controlling the lower leg where your tibia is as it moves forward. Okay, so this is a period of single limb support. Just one leg is on the ground while that body progresses through with the swing phase. Moving next to heel off. Okay, so now we're past the middle. The body's still going forward, and as you can see on that solid diagram, that solid line, the heel is now lifting off the ground as we continue to move forward. The ball of your foot and the toes are still touching the ground. On the Rancho scale, we call this terminal stance because we're almost at the end of the stance phase. Okay? So we ended mid stance, we're continuing to move forward. The critical event here is called roll off, where basically the foot is rolling forward onto that ball of the foot. And we continue to see the limb support with single leg with the body weight. Okay, it does mention that the body is falling to the contralateral limb. So that means the leg that's in the air, that's swinging through right now, your body is being pulled towards that direction because there's nothing, like think of a chair with, no legs on one side. That's the side it falls towards, right? There's no leg on the left side right now because the right leg is on ground. So your body instinctively wants to fall in that direction. So that's kind of part of the weight shifting that occurs when we're walking. And then finally with stance, we get to toe off. Now at this point, the ball of the foot, we're continuing to go forward. The toes are the last thing touching the ground before we bend that knee and lift that leg into the air. So on that solid line diagram here, the toes of the reference leg are leaving the ground, which consolidates then the end of the stance phase. Ranchos calls this pre-swing because you're basically preparing that limb for lifting it up off the ground. Okay, so it's important to know here that the opposite limb on the other side is now in contact with the ground. So this is one of those instances of double limb support that we talked about before. So your weight is now being pushed onto that other leg that just got in contact with the ground, whereas the weight on this solid line diagram is now being diminished because you're getting ready to lift it off the ground. The critical event here is you're going to flex that knee to about 35 degrees to allow you to swing the leg through. If you did not flex the knee, your foot's going to hit the ground. Okay, let's move on to the next phase. Okay, we're going to now look at the swing leg, so the swing phase. So this is where we advance the limb. It swings all the way through in order to make contact with the ground again. Toes have to clear, we have to reach the leg forward, and this results in the body as a whole moving forward. So it's propulsion of the body, and it helps prepare that limb for heel contact. So like I said, a lot of things happen with the gait cycle. We don't usually think about them. It becomes part of our motor learning, and we learn it from an early age. Think about when kids are learning how to walk. Well, watch a video of this in class. This whole process of learning to walk, they get to learning the motor pattern. Once it's accomplished, it's part of our motor learning, and we don't have to think about it. If you've ever had someone who's had a brain injury or a stroke, that might have damaged their motor learning center, and they may not remember how to walk correctly. So we might be reteaching them how to walk. Swing phase does not have as many subdivisions, so it's going to start with acceleration, which is once the toes of the reference leg leave the ground and the foot is directly under the body. Okay, so we're still looking at the solid line here on the diagram. Ranchos calls this initial swing because it begins once the toes have left the ground, so officially when it's in the air. Okay, your maximum knee flexion on that reference leg, which is the solid line leg. The critical events, that knee is going to continue to flex all the way up to 60 degrees. Your hip is now going to flex because your hip is pulling your leg forward. Okay, and we're going to go through this in class standing up so you can kind of feel how this goes, but start as you're reviewing this and you watch this video, start standing up and kind of walking through the process. Kind of walk as you go through the process of the different phases and subdivisions so you can kind of get an idea of when those occur. Okay, I've also posted a couple video links that go through this process. They're at the very top of the module here under the Gait module. So the lifting of the limb from the floor, the initial advancement of the thigh, that's all to achieve toe clearance and propel us forward. Then we come to mid-swing. Just like mid-stance, this is the point where that reference leg is directly beneath the body. So in this case, we're looking at the solid line. It's not in contact with the ground, but it has been swinging through and it's right underneath us. Ranchos also calls this mid-swing. So that's from maximum knee flexion until the tibia being vertical. Okay, so it's going to be at that point where it's continuing to come through. Hip flexes to 30 degrees here. Your ankle is dorsiflexing to 10 degrees. So your toes are pulling up as you're swinging through to prepare for heel contact again. Deceleration is just that. We're slowing the swing leg down in order to make contact with the heel on the ground again. Okay, so terminal swing is what we call it in the Ranchos system, and that's basically from the time that the tibia is completely vertical until just prior to that heel contact. So in this process, your knee is extending to make your leg straight to reach the foot to the ground for that heel contact. Okay, the tibia continues to move forward and our knee extends to create that step length. Decelerating the thigh and the maintenance of the foot position gets ready for the heel contact. So one thing I do want you to remember, how do we decelerate? Okay, we'll talk about this in class, but decelerating basically means that you're hitting the brakes. So that's usually going to be an eccentric contraction that slows this down. And in the case of this phase, our hamstrings are the ones that decelerate our swing limb in order to prepare it to contact the ground. That's also why a lot of times people will pull a hamstring when they're sprinting or when they're running. Hamstrings are not involved with the propulsion side as much. They're involved with deceleration. So the hamstrings get pulled trying to slow down that limb that's coming so fast through underneath the body. All right, just a couple last things here, and then we're going to wrap this up for this video, and we'll continue this on Tuesday. So 2 more slides. First, there's a couple variables with Gait that we need to be aware of. One's called stance time, which is just that, the amount of time that we spend in stance. We already mentioned it's 60%, but we can actually time it to look at how long we spent in it, and then look to see if it matches up with those percentages. Okay, that's going to include how long are you on one leg, how long are you on both legs for the double support time. Okay, and the last slide that I wanted to cover today, we have a couple measurements that we can look at. One is time and one is by length. Stride length is going to be the length of the reference leg traveling from heel strike to heel strike. Okay, so it's of the same. So the distance traveled during one gait cycle. So if you look at that definition of stride length, it's from heel contact of one leg to the heel contact of the same leg. So left heel contact until right foot forward, left heel contacts again. That total length between just that left heel to the left heel is going to be called a stride length. And if you notice on the definition, that means that stride length is the same thing as a gait cycle. It's just the distance traveled in a gait cycle. Stride duration is going to be how long did it take you to go through that stride length. So we can time that. Okay, let's stop with this. Looks like this video is about 20 minutes, 21 minutes long. I hope you guys enjoy some of your time off, and we'll go over this next Tuesday, but please take a look at those 2 sample videos on the module after you've watched this one, and I hope to answer any questions that you have on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.